All right, well, now we're going to talk about lenses. Lenses come in all different shapes and sizes to accomplish all different types of things. Lenses come from wide-angle lenses to telephoto lenses and standard lenses that are in between. There's lots of terminology, and it's easy to get confused when it comes to lenses. I pretty much have a lens across every spectrum, every category of lens, except for a macro lens, which is a lens that I'm going to be making a purchase for in the near future. So we'll start with the lenses that work best for close-up and work our way towards the longer lenses. So, of course, the close-up lenses are the macro lenses. If you've ever used your point-and-shoot camera, it typically has a macro function. DSLR cameras typically don't have a macro function. It becomes a function of the lens. And what macro does is it allows you to focus close up on items. So, for example, if you're taking a picture of a flower or an insect or something really tiny, you're going to want a macro lens in order to get the best depth and picture out of that specific item. Of course, you can do that with some of these other lenses, but many of these other lenses have a longer focus range, which means that you can't get as close up to certain items, is what I'm trying to say. When you zoom in on something, of course, you're bringing it closer to you when you're far away. But when you want to take a picture of something that you can get close up to, some of these lenses, like for example, these telephoto lenses, you have to be a certain distance away from an object before focus can even happen. And so that point of focus is further away, and it becomes harder to take a picture of items that you want extreme detail that are small, which is what you would get a macro lens for. Macro lenses can allow you to get extremely close. They even have macro lenses that are far away, like a 100mm macro lens, which means you can stand back far away from it. But the macro lens is designed to get detail on small objects. You can pull that off on some other lenses, but it's not as easy. Next from a macro lens would be a typical wide-angle lens, which some would consider a fisheye lens. This lens right here, which is the Canon 14mm 2.8, is an extremely wide-angle lens. 14mm gives you a very wide-angle view, which means that items that are further away are going to look really small in your photo, but you're going to be able to get a large image view. I use this lens at weddings because I like to step back for a second and take a picture of the entire ceremony and everything that's around it, so that you get kind of like a nice wide-angle view of everything that's going on in that area. I don't shoot with this lens very often unless I'm trying to do something special. A wide-angle lens like that isn't a very practical lens to have. It's only good to use in certain situations. Same goes with a macro lens, which is only good in certain situations. You wouldn't use a macro lens for taking portrait photos unless you were taking pictures of doing a portrait, maybe for taking pictures of glasses or something like that. You wouldn't use a macro lens for too many things. So next to a 14mm lens, I also have a 35mm lens, a 40mm lens, and a 50mm lens that are fixed zoom lenses, which means that there's no zoom range. They're just a flat zoom and that's it, or a flat focal range and that's it. Just like this 14mm, if I want to get closer or further away from something, I have to physically move the camera back. So I have to walk back or forth in order to do that. A lens that I've used a lot over the years is the Canon 24 to 70mm 2.8. This is the first version of this lens, and the second version of this lens is actually mounted to that camera that I'm looking into right now. This lens is fantastic because it has a 24mm beginning, which means I can get a pretty wide view of something right from standing right in front of it. But then again, if I need to stand back or something's a little bit further away, I have some zoom and I can get up to 70mm and get quite a bit further away. And this has always worked out as a fantastic lens. It's a 2.8 aperture. We're going to talk about apertures later on and the importance of those numbers. With your lens, the lower the aperture number, which most of my lenses are 2.8 or lower, the lower the aperture, the more light you're going to be able to get in through the lens, which means that these lenses that are 2.8 and lower are going to do much better in low light situations than a lens that might be a 4 or a 5.4 or something like that. Kit lenses that come with these cameras typically are in that higher, 4, 5.4 range or something like that, which is just fine if you're taking pictures outside, but not so much if you're taking pictures inside in low light situations. So what that actually means is the aperture inside of the lens opens and closes to let in certain amount of light. And the lower number means it has a wider aperture, which means it can open up further. And a smaller aperture means it can close down further. If you've ever looked into your DSLR camera and seen a tiny little pinhole that it looks like your photo's going through, that's the aperture for a small aperture up towards maybe 11, 12, 13 and higher apertures to let in a small amount of light for taking pictures outside on a bright day. But when you're in a low light situation, you need to be able to let a lot more light in through to hit that sensor on your camera, and the lower the aperture, the better. Currently, Canon has lenses that go all the way down to a 1.2 aperture, which is pretty wide, and there's things that are good and bad about that at the same time. The wider the aperture, which means the bigger the lens, amount of light that can go through the lens, the shallower depth of field you're going to get, which means when you take a picture of something, everything in the background is going to be blurred out. If you've ever seen those photos that look really neat because the person is in or the object is in focus and everything in the back just looks like really blurry, it could be done in the lens by using a wide aperture. The smaller the aperture, the more things can be in focus behind your actual focal point. So sometimes, just to prevent things being out of focus, I will shoot at 5.4 or 6 or somewhere right in between 5.4 and 8 so that I make sure that I have things in focus and also have a little bit of depth of field as well. All right, so moving on, we've looked at this 24-70, which is my go-to lens. If I had to choose a lens to take with me and I couldn't take any other lenses, it would be this lens because it's so versatile and useful. From there, we have lenses that can range anywhere, from starting at 35 millimeter or 18 millimeter on up to into the hundreds. But for me, my next step is the 70 to 200 Canon telephoto lens. This lens has a lot of features and is a very useful lens for me. I use this for portraits. I use this when I can't get close to an object where I need a lot of zoom. I like it because it's a self-contained lens, unlike the lens of this original 24-70, which grows when you zoom. And this is standard in a lot of lenses. When you zoom in one direction or the other, it moves the length of the lens. That's good and all, but sometimes you could bump it, or if you're trying to hold on to a focal range, which means you've gotten focused on something, and then you move your camera, you could bump it and then your focus is gone. With this lens, it's all self-contained. Everything's happening inside of the lens, so there's none of that lens extension going on. I know there's a technical term for that, but it's not important because I try to avoid it. There are also options on some of these lenses, and a lot of lenses are becoming more and more common with options, as you see on this lens. For example, all lenses pretty much have an autofocus and a manual focus option. With autofocus enabled, typically if your camera is set up the way that it came from the factory, when you brush the sensor with your finger, when you push it down to pre-fire, so before you push it down all the way and take the picture, you go down part way, your camera will want to start focusing and try to find an item to focus on with autofocus turned on. If you turn autofocus off, then you're going to be focusing manually using the focus ring on your camera. This might be good if you're shooting in a low light situation and your camera is having a hard time focusing for you. You can manually focus and then turn off autofocus so that way your camera doesn't try to refocus when you hit the shutter button. I find myself going into manual focus for purposes of shooting video, like what we're looking at right now, because I am using a DSLR camera to shoot this video. So I will go into manual focus so that the camera doesn't try to do anything tricky on me when I have focus already set. Low light situations, like I explained, it's sometimes easier just to have autofocus turned off, so that way your camera doesn't try to refocus when you've already taken the time to focus perfectly. When you're on a tripod and stuff like that, where your distance between your camera and your subject or your object aren't moving, sometimes going into manual focus will save you having to try and focus all over again when you already have focus. So most of the time, though, I'm not going into manual focus mode when I'm shooting weddings. I almost rarely go into manual focus. Most of the time I'm in autofocus, just because I need the camera to be able to go and grab that focus for me quickly so that I'm not searching around for it, because the camera does do a better job of focusing on the fly in decent situations than I could. I have to squint a little bit or really try and look and see, or use the zoom functions on the back of the camera in order to to figure that out. So there's also stabilization on this as well. Image stabilization helps you keep things steady by adding a little bit of forgiveness inside of the lens. So when you're trying to take a picture, rather than having it come out blurry because you might have moved a little bit, there's a little bit of forgiveness built into these lenses. I found that as these cameras become much better and you're able to keep your settings more appropriate for situations, you need stabilization less, but it's still great to have it. Stabilization, the only lens that I have that has stabilization is this 70-200. The Canon, for example, just came out with a 2470 that has image stabilization, but it's an f4 lens and it doesn't go down to a 2.8 like the lenses that I have. So for me, having the f4 as my widest aperture isn't very good, and I'd prefer not to have that lens with stabilization over having a 2.8 aperture with stabilization. From that, there are other types of lenses. If you have a mirrorless lens, the lenses are going to be a little bit different for that type of camera. And then there are also lenses with further zoom than 200. What I use if I need to go beyond that 200 range is a extension that you can add on to your camera. Now, this extension goes in between your lens and your camera, and it does take away from your aperture. So the widest aperture of your camera, which on this lens is 2.8, when I add this, I'm going to lose a couple of stops. And what stops are is your aperture, basically, and the amount of light that's coming through is a stop of light. And when you add this, you're going to lose a little bit of that. But if I'm outdoors and it's a nice sunny day, it's not going to matter. I'm not going to be shooting at 2.8 anyway. So adding this between my camera and my lens is not going to be a big deal. And this is going to help me get up to 400 millimeters of zoom out of a 200 millimeter lens, which is fantastic. So that's a brief overview of lenses. Most lenses come with some sort of a lens hood, which I use outdoors to block sun coming in and giving glare into my photo. Sometimes it's kind of cool to have glare, but it's definitely not to have glare in all of your photos. So I use these quite often on my lenses just to prevent that from happening. So now that we've taken a look at our lenses, we have, of course, some other options, and we'll start looking at lighting as well, which is a tricky subject. So in the next couple videos, we're going to talk about lighting.